Today on Nova Legends podcast, I want to talk about the Hayfield Hawks, the 2022 undefeated state champion Hayfield Hawks, and where do they stand in history of Northern Virginia public basketball, high school basketball teams. Recently, we've had some discussion on our Facebook group about Hayfield and how it stands not only next to the great teams in Northern Virginia, but the great Hayfield teams. And because there's been quite a few really good Hayfield teams that went to the state tournament. And there's been other great teams in the area. And there's been so many changes to basketball in Northern Virginia. So I thought it might be an interesting discussion to talk about this particular Hayfield team and where it stands. I think when you talk about the great teams in the history of Northern Virginia, particularly the former Northern region, you have to start first with Parker Gray, which is 1957 team. This is before integration, an all-black team. And Coach Jim Lewis saw them play, and he puts them amongst the best teams he's ever seen. Obviously, it's very hard to compare those teams to the teams of today, and not very many people saw the Parker Gray team play. But I do believe they played in a national tournament in Chicago and actually won. Obviously, you have to talk about the Washington Lee team of 1966. It was the first integrated team to win the AAA state championship. That was called 1A back then, but the highest classification. And they were led by John Hummer, who played, I believe, in the NBA for a bit after starting for Princeton, and had many other good players. So I'm sure that Washington Lee team, if not one of the best teams in the history of the area, was definitely one of the most important teams. But if you talk about the so-called maybe in the modern era, I think many people will argue that the 1977 T.C. Williams Titans, now Alexandria City Titans, of course, the undefeated team led by Little Willie Jackson and Frank Holloway, is one of the best teams in the history of Northern Virginia. Red Jenkins, Coach Red Jenkins, who's seen all the great teams, including this year's team, has argued that this is the best team he's ever seen in Northern Virginia. I think you have to also talk about the 1980 Gar-Field team. That team obviously was in the Northwest region, but it was in Prince William County, also undefeated, led by Othell Wilson, beat a very good Booker T team in that final, which I saw. Obviously, this team has got to be considered one of the best teams in the history of Northern Virginia. Also had Steve Smith, who played at George Washington, and other good players. One of the teams that's has a mystique because of what it accomplished is Robert E. Lee, 1981 state champions, coached by Charlie Thompson. Now, this team, in terms of individual talent, would not rate amongst the best teams anyone's ever seen. I believe it had two Division III players, Rod Wood and Tony Ferris, and also a great player named Todd Christ, who I think played college soccer. But in terms of great teams, this was a great team. Some of the parts off the charts. Charlie Thompson did a great job with his team, and they beat some really good teams down at state. I think when you look at that era of Northern Virginia high school basketball between 77 and 81, Northern Virginia teams won, I believe, 4 out of 5 state championships. So you had a high level of basketball being played here at the time. This is before Flint Hill was taking any players. I believe Kevin Darmody had gone to O'Connell, but still all the good players at that point were staying in the public school. So I think the T.C. Williams team, the Gar-Field team, and the Robert E. Lee team are certainly have to be considered some of the best teams in the history of Northern Virginia. And also the 79 Mount Vernon team won the state title as well, even though I wouldn't put that team quite in the same class as the greatest ever, but definitely a great team. Well, then it was 27 years until there was a state champion from the Northern region, and that was T.C. Williams Titans. That was an undefeated team, very balanced team. They beat Bethel in the state final by more than 20 points. They lost a couple games during the season, but the team became completely dominant during the postseason. They had big players that could score from outside. They had size. One of the best teams I've ever seen play for Northern Virginia. Even though we hadn't won a state championship in those 27 years between 81 and 2008, Potomac from Dale City, coached by Kendall Hayes, had won in '95. That was a great team as well. I think at least 2 or 3 Division I players. We had a poll on Nova Legends, and many considered this one of the best teams in the history of Northern Virginia. So I think that team belongs in the conversation as well. One of the arguments you're going to hear for why this Hayfield team may not quite measure up to some of the great teams of the past is because all the talent has gone to the private schools now. I want to talk about that in particular. I do think, obviously, there are more players that go to the private schools that are top prospects. And, I think in the 80s and 90s, the top players would go to private school. Not even the top players go, even just the solid players generally go to private schools. So there has been some bleeding of talent in the area. But I will say there's also, in terms of private schools, there's actually more private schools as well. So they have to share talent too. So it's not like you're just Flint Hill, or there's just, St. Albans downtown, or O'Connell, or even Bishop Ireton. There are a lot of private schools in Northern Virginia. So I wonder how their talent stacks up against some of the previous private school competition. But in terms of the public school itself, I went to a lot of games this year, and the level of play in the public school is very high, and I don't think it's diminished at all. And here's why I say that. First of all, the skill level is very high because I think the players train with private trainers now. More kids on a team can shoot outside shots than ever before. I think in the 90s, maybe you have a couple players, one player on a team that was a 3-point threat. Many teams have lots of 3-point threats. So I think the skill level is very high, which I think comes down to a lot of private training, and just, even people watch YouTube and probably go out in the backyard and practice what they learn. But I just think there's more of a commitment to skill. There's also more weight training and performance training that didn't really exist to the same level as does now. I know when I talked to Coach Carlos Poindexter of Hayfield, his team, the commitment they have to weight training, even after games, was very impressive. And you can tell by the kids, they have some physical specimens on the court. And you could definitely see that throughout the public school leagues this year. But also just the AAU. The kids are playing leagues all year long. There are so many leagues out there to play. I think over time, more kids can find AAU teams. More kids are playing basketball all year round. More kids are specializing in basketball and not playing other sports. So I think when you think about the public school and the quality of the level, you can't just say kids are going to private school. You have to look at the players that are remaining and how well they play. And I think when you look at them, they play very well. I played point guard for Robinson, the class of 1984. I was in a division with, I think we had 8 Division I players the year my senior year. I played against Frank Smith. I played against Glenn Williams. I played against Tommy Amaker the year before. When I think about Garden Braylon Wheeler, the point guard for Hayfield, he would be a handful. I think people are foolish to dismiss the talent of the kids of today, because these kids can play, and I think the game has actually evolved and actually gotten better. One argument that you hear is that some of the great teams in the past lost to great teams, lost to teams with high Division I players or whatever. You hear that. You hear that as an argument why some of the teams in Northern Virginia may have been great that didn't win state tournaments. Well, if you want to be great, you have to beat great teams, and you can't be considered one of the greatest teams in history if you don't beat great teams. So the fact that you may have played teams with more than mid-major Division I talent, that's not going to be an excuse for why you should be considered one of the greatest teams in the history of the area of basketball. That's part of it. You have to be able to beat great teams. Also, talent level is important, how much individual talent you have on the team. But what we're really talking about are best teams, best teams in terms of winning games and playing together are the things that make a great team. I'd mentioned Lee before, the Lancers, now Lewis from 1981. That was an example of a great team. But if you look at the South Lakes teams in the late 80s and the 1989 South Lakes team and the 1990 South Lakes teams. Now, the 1990 South Lakes teams, when I mentioned to Grant Hill that was one of the most talented teams I had ever seen, with Joey Beard, with Grant, with Howard Hogan, with Theron Curry. I mean, tall Division I talent. They did not win the region that year. They lost to Wakefield, and then they lost early at states to Hampton. I think Grant considered it the better team to be the year before when he had played with Rob Robinson, Mike Ellison, Chucky Gibson, Mike Taylor. That team wasn't as talented in terms of Division I talent, but they played well together. So I think those are the kind of considerations you have to make if you're talking about the greatest team ever. One thing you're going to hear is that there's too many classifications now, and it's easier to win a state title now. Without a doubt, this is a valid criticism. It's true. It's unfortunate. One of the, I think, almost travesties to high school basketball is that a Northern Region teams from the former Northern Region, which includes now the Occoquan region, because the Northern Region has been divided in half, is guaranteed a spot in the state final every year. So it used to be tough just to get to the state final. Now there's going to be a Northern Region, team from the former Northern Region in the state final every year. So obviously that's going to take away from achievement. It's unfortunate, but it's not the fault of Hayfield or the team that benefits from that. It's just in the presumption they're going to have to overcome. It's not going to be enough just to win the state title if you're going to be considered the best, because in some regard, the state title is a regional title. There's too many great teams that you don't have to play this year. Like, for example, Varina, who had beaten a tough collegiate team by 20 early in the year, a private school. Collegiate is a private school in Richmond that had blown out a Flint Hill team up here. They won the Class 4 championship and has a legitimate claim as a great team. They only had lost to Highland Springs, who was in the Class 5 championship, Final Four at states. And then obviously the teams from the Eastern region, most of the best teams aren't in Division 6. Again, this is unfortunate. I don't know what's being done. It doesn't seem like anything's being done. There's no commitment to create a state tournament to determine the best. There's other considerations that are more important now, and I don't understand them. Most of them are, well, it doesn't matter. There's other, the small schools want a chance. I haven't heard any compelling reason to have 6 state champions in the state the size of Virginia. I think 3, maybe 4 would be all we'd need. It would create a true competition. But anyway, so the question is, if Hayfield's going to be considered one of the best teams of all time, they would have to do more than just win state. And I would argue that they did do more. First of all, they're undefeated. They never lost. Most of the games they won by 20 or more points. They had very few close games, and that includes really good teams. John Marshall was nationally ranked. John Marshall is in Richmond. They're only in Division II, the second smallest classifications, but it is basically an AAU team that all plays high school together. And Hayfield went down there on the road down in Petersburg, Virginia, and blew them out of the gym. They beat Lansdowne down in Virginia Beach. Lansdowne has Donald Hand, who's going to Boston College. Wiley's seen as one of the top ranked teams in the state of Virginia this year. Handled them as well. Bishop Ireton, they had Jamie Kaiser, who transferred from Lake Braddock, one of the top players from public school in Northern Virginia the year before. And Hayfield blew them out on their home court in a very hostile environment. Hayfield did all they could do. They couldn't have been more impressive in the games. And then when you look at their individual talent, Greg Jones is a huge prospect. He's going to go down as one of the best players in the history of the area, and definitely a public school player in the history of the area. He's going to get some big looks from more than mid-majors next year. They also have Braylon Wheeler, which just a tremendous point guard, great vision, not only in the full court, but in half court game, great defender, can shoot the 3-pointer, tough kid. I should talk about at least the top 6, because they're all really good players. And I'm going to stop at the 2 because the other 4 are also top players, top high school players. They unselfish, play hard, play defense, score, all the things you want. And they all will have promising post-high school careers if they choose to have them. Also, you have to talk about Coach Carlos Poindexter. He has a great connection with his players. I did a podcast with the team, the top six members of that team and coach, and you can tell he has really dialed into the strengths of his players and making them better. And one of the reasons why they're so good is how he manages them over time, and also game management. He knows how to push the right buttons on this team, and the reason why the games aren't often close is because of the way Coach Carlos has done with the team, and he has to be commended. And he's going to go down as one of the greatest coaches in the history of the area as well. A lot of these arguments are unfair to Hayfield. Um, they can only um, they can only beat the teams that are put in front of them. We have to settle these arguments on the court, and I firmly believe that Hayfield did that this year. They beat every team put in front of them. They went out and they saw even tougher competition, and I'm really excited to see what the kids do that graduated this year, but also what the kids coming back, and they have 3 starters coming back. What they can accomplish going forward. When you're a state champion and you're undefeated, and you play the kind of basketball they play, we have to commend them and take our hats off to them because they made Northern Virginia basketball proud.